Welcome back, America. We're going to continue our conversation now with one of the people leading the most important congressional investigation involving China right now in the Congress. He is Congressman Mike Gallagher from the great state of Wisconsin. He joins us right now. Congressman, great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
In the block just before this, we had a pretty robust conversation with the former National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. And everybody in the world is worried about where we are with Taiwan, what China might do in the weakness of the Biden administration with Taiwan. Tell us what you've been learning through the great work you're doing with your committee.
Well, when I was in Taiwan a couple months ago, probably my biggest takeaway was that we need to actually deliver the weapons that they've purchased that have been approved, but are backlogged right now. There's a $19 billion backlog. And I think one of the clear lessons of the war in Ukraine is that only hard power deters. The vague threat of sanctions or, mean tweets coming out of the State Department doesn't give us a chance at deterrence. Only hard power deters. So if we don't want to experience a massive deterrence failure like that we see in Ukraine, we need to make sure we're surging hard power to the Indo-Pacific. And the Biden administration is just not moving with a sense of urgency. The head of Indo-Pacific Command told me 2 weeks ago that he wasn't concerned about stockpiles of key munitions in the region. That's crazy. I mean, every war game I've played, we run out of key munitions very quickly. So there's a lot more we need to be doing. We need to be moving heaven and earth in order to enhance deterrence across the Taiwan Strait, because we don't want a massive conventional war with China. The final thing I'd say, John, is for whatever reason, we tend to discount what dictators like Xi Jinping say when they're speaking to their own people or party members. But Xi Jinping keeps saying that he wants to unify Taiwan with the mainland by force if necessary. And for Wall Street or the Biden administration to discount that possibility, I think is incredibly geopolitically naive.
Do you have some sense of why the Pentagon has this laissez-faire sort of approach to this? I mean, the threat is real. When you talk to the admirals on the front lines of the Pacific Fleet, they know that it's a real threat. Why the slowness? Does Ukraine and maybe some of these other woke issues distract them from actually getting the job done in Taiwan?
Well, the growth of the DEI cottage industry and all the woke issues has definitely been a distraction. It also, in my opinion, has had a dampening effect on recruitment. I think perhaps a broader issue, though, is that the Biden administration is conflicted. There are some who think that China is the main issue, and a lot of them pay lip service to that. But if you actually read the national security strategy, if you actually listen to what top officials are saying, it's clear that the top issue for them is climate change. And a lot of people, like former Secretary of State John Kerry, think naively that you can somehow cooperate with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to climate change, as if he cares about commitments made at COP27. So those competing issues really create an incoherent approach. And now you have this other issue where if you listen to Janet Yellen's speech last week,
right.
Clearly they're also trying to engage economically, go back to the sort of engagement hypothesis that failed before. And so it's sort of this weird conflicting policy that I think undermines our ability to actually prioritize the Pacific, prioritize hard power. Final thing I'd say is if you look at the Pentagon strategy, the cornerstone of it is this concept of integrated deterrence. I think this is a very dangerous concept because it basically means you can somehow substitute soft power for hard power, substitute non-military instruments and still have a greater deterrent effect. I just don't think that's the case. And it really, again, it undermines our focus and our urgency.
Yeah, I think history has shown only peace through strength works. Any other options have never really succeeded. So I want to talk a little bit about the work of the committee. You are doing some of the most important work in Congress. And in many ways, Congress is ahead of the Biden administration in trying to get this country prepared for what lies ahead. What has been some of the most surprising information you've learned as you've dug in and gotten access to some of the intelligence and other things that we're now learning about China's intentions?
Well, I continue to be shocked at the divide between, let's say, the national security community when it comes to Taiwan, where I think there's an increasing consensus that we're in the window of maximum danger, that this could really heat up, particularly starting next year when Taiwan has an election and we also have an election and might be distracted. But if you then talk to Wall Street, they just have a totally different view of this. And they think, well, Xi Jinping would never invade Taiwan. It wouldn't be in his economic interest. And that divide is really dangerous. So the more that I engage with people in different communities outside the national security community, the more I sense gaps. And that's a problem. I mentioned wargaming earlier. We tend not, from a military perspective, to include financial and economic competition or escalation or warfare when we do these war games. And that creates a huge gap. It creates a disconnect in our strategy. Again, look at Ukraine to see the dangers of sort of trying to make up a sanctions regime on the fly. So that's one thing. I will say I've been struck in the early work at the amount of bipartisanship on the issue. Or let's say, so thus far, Republicans and Democrats on the committee are talking in very clear language about the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party. For example, one of the first events we did was I held a rally outside one of these illegal Chinese Communist Party police stations in the heart of Manhattan. And I was joined by a Democratic member of the committee, Richie Torres, who was talking in very strong language about it. That's the final thing. This issue of transnational repression. I think everything I've seen thus far really hammers home the point that this isn't some distant over there threat. This isn't a matter of some obscure territorial claim in the South China Sea. This is really a threat to our sovereignty, whether it's through illegal police stations or the Chinese spy balloon drifting over nuclear facilities. I don't think that the threat posed by the CCP is going to be contained within China's borders. I think it's a global threat, and increasingly they want to export their model of total techno-totalitarian control around the world.
Yeah, and I think your early work on the committee has been inviting. You've actually given room for Democrats who I think were repressed by Nancy Pelosi to actually come forward and express the concerns they apparently had in private for the last few years. I want to pivot to an oddity that goes on right now. You mentioned Wall Street, and that's one of the great challenges we have. A second one is we have states like Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, that are willing to invite the Chinese in and literally give hundreds of millions of dollars of tax incentives to assist China, which wants to take over the entire global battery market. How troublesome is it that states are sometimes undercutting a larger national strategy?
It's incredibly concerning. And time and again, we've just seen, what do politicians want, right? They want the photo and the ribbon cutting, and they want credit for all these jobs being created. And they're not stepping back to think, okay, where's this money coming from? In this case, it's even more perverse because it's taxpayer money that could then presumably enrich the Chinese Communist Party. I think as we look at this issue, there's a few principles we need to keep in mind. One is, at least in key areas like pharmaceuticals, microelectronics, I would say energetics, AI, quantum, we need to reclaim our economic independence. We can't be dependent on China for critical technology and the provision of critical goods, because if we find ourselves in a confrontation with them kinetically, they'll weaponize those supply chains. They threatened to cut off the export of pharmaceuticals in the early parts of the pandemic to plunge us into a sea of coronavirus. So we're going to have to figure out a way to onshore, nearshore key industries and wean ourselves off our dependency on China. The other thing is we look at the flow of U.S. capital to China. We need to make sure that we're not funding our own destruction. We do not want to be sending American money or making American investors dependent on the health of the Chinese military or on the success of their genocidal project in Xinjiang, which is why I think it makes sense to cut off the flow of U.S. capital to key industries or the ability of certain asset managers to get rich off PLA's military modernization or genocide. This is the most difficult aspect of the competition. I can wrap my head easily around the military side of the competition. The ideological human rights side I can wrap my head around. When it comes to economic statecraft and this difficult process of selective economic decoupling, it's very complex because for over 2 decades, we've been integrating China into the global economy. We've been naive. They took advantage of our naivety. They pocketed all the gains. They made none of the concessions. They didn't turn into a responsible stakeholder. Now we have to reverse it. There's no easy way to do it, but we can start by making sure that governors in states like Michigan don't have a naive and counterproductive view of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, so important. So we got about a minute left. I just want to ask this. We're heading into the summer. What are the things we should be looking at from your committee to enrich us all a little bit more on a strategy and on learning more about China's threat?
Well, we're going to be doing a series of hearings this summer. One is on the AI race with China we're going to explore, and then the other is on economic and financial competition, hopefully with some prominent voices like Peter Robinson, who can tell us about the lessons that we learned in the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, and they could be applied to the new Cold War with communist China. Throughout all of it, I really have two core functions in mind. One is to explain to our colleagues and the American people why this matters, why someone should care about the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party in Green Bay, Wisconsin, or in Washington, D.C. But the other is to make sure we're collecting the absolute best legislation and policy initiatives on China that we can actually pass this Congress and get some stuff done, even in a divided Congress. That's what the Speaker asked us to do, and that's what we're doing right now.
Progress even among division. That's what your committee's been doing already. A lot of people, the eyes of the world really are watching all the great work you're doing. Sir, what a great honor to have you on the show today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back with more of this conversation right after these messages.